Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In light of Ramadan coming in during our explanation of Al-Mukhtasar As-Sagher, we are jumping to the chapter of fasting so that way we may cover it with the knowledge needed from this text during this blessed month. The author says Babu Siyam, which means the chapter of fasting. يثبت دخول رمضان باستكمال شعبان 30 أو رؤية الهلال. Ramadan begins with Sha'ban either completing 30 days, because a month cannot be more than 30 or less than 29, or seeing the moon, the crescent, because when I see the moon, right, that's an indication of the new month entering. Now, normally I need 2 witnesses for this, but when it comes to Ramadan, he tells us, وَيَكْفِي شَهَادَةُ عَدْلٍ. One trustworthy person is suffice to make the announcement. The author then says, فصل في شروط صحة الصوم. These are the conditions that must be fulfilled in order for the fast to be considered valid. He says, وَشُرُوطُ صِحَّةِ الصَّوْمِ, from the conditions of having an accurate or correct or a sound fasting, النية, the intention. فَإِنْ كَانَ فَرْضًا, meaning if the fast was an obligatory, an obligation fast, اشترط التبيت قبل الفجر. And that's because of the hadith that says that a person will not have a fast unless they do tabiit of their niyyah. So tabiit means the night prior you intend. You intend what? That you're going to fast. And he explains this by saying, وَالتَّعْيِينُ كَصَوْمِ رَمَضَانَ أَوْ نَذْرٍ, like intending that you're going to fast tomorrow as one of the days of the month of Ramadan. Or a nadhr, meaning if you took an oath to fast, once you do this, that fast becomes an obligation upon you. Then the author says, وَشَرْطُ صِحَّةُ الصَّوْمِ الْإِمْسَاكُ عَنِ الْجِمَاعِ عَمْدًا وعن الاستمناء وعن الاستقاءة وعن وصول عين إلى ما يسمى جوفا كباطن أذن أو إحليل من منفذ مفتوح فلا يضر وصول دهن بتشرب المسام ولا طعم الكحل بحلقه. Another condition that must be fulfilled in order for the fast to be considered valid is to abstain from sexual intercourse deliberately, meaning you fully know that you're fasting and you know that you're not allowed to do this, but you do it anyway. وعن الاستمناء, and that's forms of self-pleasure, meaning in a sexual manner. وعن الاستقاءة, making yourself hurl or vomit. وعن وصول عين, or from allowing a substance, إلى ما يسمى جوفا, from getting into a cavity of the body. So we're not talking about your limbs, we're talking about your stomach, your chest, your head, and so on. And then he goes on to explain what are some of those jawf. He says, كباطن أذن, deep within your ear, before the drum, obviously. The scholars of our school will define the barrier point that if you cross, you'll be breaking your fast, and that is as soon as the first curve in the ear opening. All right, so you want to be very careful stuffing things in your ears or using things to clean out your ears while you are fasting. أو إحليل من منفذ مفتوح, like a tool, like a dripper, in from an opening, like from the mouth or from the ears, inserting something and then allowing a substance to go through. But now this is then Begs the question, well, what if I put like a cream or a lotion on my skin? This is why the author says, فلا يضر وصول دهن بتشرب المسام. When you put a cream or an ointment on and the skin absorbs it, that doesn't break your fast. Why? Because if you look in what the author said here, he said, من منفذ مفتوح, a naturally open access point to the core of your body, to the cavities of your body. So that'd be mouth, that'd be nose, that'd be ears. So your skin absorbing something does not break your fast. ولا طعم الكحل بحلقه. If someone has some form of kuhl on their eyes, like an eyeliner type of thing, and you taste it in your throat, that doesn't break your fast because your eyes are treated like your skin. They absorb things. The author then says, ولا يفطر إذا فعل ذلك جاهلا أو ناسيا أو مكرها. But the fast is not broken if someone breaks any of these conditions that we just stated, right? Out of ignorance, or they are forgetful, or they are forced to do any of these things. ويفطر بخروج المني بلمس بلا حائل أو قبلة أو مضاجعة لا بفكر ونظر. Now, if one were to ejaculate, and this happens because they were fondling, skin-to-skin contact, kissing, cuddling, or hugging, right, then this breaks the fast. But if it happened just from thinking about something, daydreaming about something, this does not break the fast. You still shouldn't do it, but we're just speaking about the cause of it. He says, وَشَرْطُ صِحَّةِ الصَّوْمِ أيضا. And now we spoke about the conditions that make the fast valid and accepted and sound. But what conditions do also need to be present within you in order for your act to be sound and valid? He says, Al-Islam, the person needs to be a Muslim. So if a non-Muslim fasts, it doesn't count. It does not amount to anything. Wal-aqlu, the individual needs to be sane. Okay, recognizing what they're doing. وَالنَّقَاءُ عَنِ الْحَيْضِ وَالنِّفَاسِ فِي جَمِيعِ النَّهَارِ. And our sisters need to be free from postpartum bleeding, menses, for the entirety of the time of the fast. He says, وَيَحْرُمُ صَوْمِ الْعِيدَيْنِ وَأَيَّامِ التَّشْرِيقِ وَيَحْرُمُ صَوْمِ النِّصْفِ الْأَخِيرِ مِنْ شَعْبَانَ إِلَّا لِنَذْرٍ أَوْ قَضَاءٍ أَوْ كَفَّارَةٍ أَوْ وِرْدٍ. Now he's moving on to times beyond Ramadan when you're not allowed to fast. He first mentions the two Eids, Eid al-Adha and Eid al-Fitr. Eid al-Fitr comes after Ramadan, and Eid al-Adha comes with Yawm al-Nahr in what a lot of people refer to as the Big Eid, right? It's connected to Hajj. He also mentions Ayyam al-Tashriq. Ayyam al-Tashriq. And they are the 11th, 12th, and 13th of the Hijjah. And they are the 3 days that follow Yawm al-Nahr. He says, وَيَحْرُمُ صَوْمِ النِّصْفِ الْأَخِيرِ مِنْ شَعْبَانَ. The second half of Sha'ban. You're not allowed to fast in that. And what they mean by not allowed is that you're not allowed to initiate. But if you had a habit of fasting Mondays and Thursdays, or you're making up a previous Ramadan, you can fast them. That's why he says, illa. He's making an exception here. What are the exceptions, ya Shaykh? He says, nadhr. You took an oath to fast a certain day, and it just happened to be in the second half of Sha'ban. You're going to go ahead and fast, because once you take that oath, it becomes an obligation upon you to do. Aw qada, you're making up a previous Ramadan or a previous fast that you had to make up. Aw kaffaratin, and that kaffara, as we'll learn inshallah ta'ala in fiqh, is something that you do to make up for an error that you have committed. Okay, you have fidya and you have kaffara. Kaffara usually is connected to fasting. Okay? A wirdin, meaning that you had a habit of fasting, like I gave an example earlier, I said Mondays and Thursdays, or the 3 days in the middle of the month, or 3 days at the end of the month, and so on. Whatever habit of fasting you had, you can maintain it even though you're not allowed to initiate a new fast during this time. The author then says, فَصْلٌ فِي شُرُوطِ وُجُوبِ الصَّوْمِ. We are speaking about these things that need to be present within you, right, in order for Ramadan to be an obligation upon you. So we spoke about conditions that are needed to be fulfilled in order for the fast to be valid. We spoke about conditions that are needed within you, so that way your fulfillment of that is valid. Now we're speaking about conditions that need to be present within you in order for Ramadan to be an obligation or considered as an obligation upon you. Okay? He says, Al-Aqlu, sanity. Al-Bulughu, you pass the age of puberty. Wal-Qudratu ala as-Sawm. Some ulama will refer to this as Al-Itaqa, meaning the physical ability to fast. So, sanity, puberty, and the physical ability to do so. Now, of course, if we say physical ability and we say puberty, then the question then obviously then begs itself. Well, what about children? He explains, he says, وَيُؤْمَرُ بِهِ الصَّبِيُّ إِذَا أَطَاقَ لِسَبْعٍ. When a child hits 7, they should be commanded to start fasting. Okay? If they're able to. And you can work out a system of training where you train them to be able to do a fast. وَيُضْرَبُ عَلَى تَرْكِهِ لِعَشْرٍ. Discipline of not fasting should begin around the age of 10. You're preparing them as a parent, as a guardian. You have that responsibility to prepare them for the world. Their worship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one of those things that you are required to prepare them for. He says, وَيَجُوزُ الْفِطْرُ لِلْمُسَافِرِ سَفَرًا طَوِيلًا مُبَاحًا. If a person is traveling, a travel that is halal for them to do, and it's tawil, that means it's over 75 kilometers, then they are allowed to not fast. Okay? If the travel is halal, if it is a travel that is tawil. He says, وَلِلْمَرِيضِ إِذَا خَافَ الضَّرَّ عَلَى نَفْسِهِ. And a person who is ill, right, and they are afraid that if they were to fast, they would be harming themselves, they can not fast. وَلِلْحَامِلِ وَالْمُرْضِعِ إِذَا خَافَتَا عَلَى أَنفُسِهِمَا أو على الولد أو لإنقاذ حيوان مشرف على الهلاك. A woman that's pregnant or she's breastfeeding, whether they feared for their own well-being or for the child, they can break their fast. They don't have to fast. Or if you see someone or an animal drowning, for example, and you just have no energy to go and help them and save them, but if you were to get one glass of water, that would give you enough boost of energy to run out there, swim, and save their lives. Then go ahead. Break the fast. All right, but what's the outcome? You know, do I have to make these up? He tells us, وَيَقْدُونَ كُلُّهُم. These people that were mentioned, the traveler, the one that's sick, the woman that's pregnant, the woman that's breastfeeding, the person who is trying to save someone's life, all of them have to make up. They have to make up what? That day that they broke their fast. Or days. They have to make it up. Okay? He says, وَيَجِبُ مَعَ الْقَضَاءِ. But along with making up that day, there's fidya that's needed. So I need to compensate for this breaking But is that for everyone? No. He says a mud of food, of grain, for example. Mud is where you put both of your hands together, curl up the tips of your fingers a little bit, right? And you fill that up with grain for each day you break your fast. Is that for all of those people? No. He's naming who this applies to. Two, or three actually, out of the scenarios we mentioned earlier. Number one, he says, على من أفطر لإنقاذ حيوان محترم مشرف على الهلاك. For the one who had to break his fast to swim out there and save that person from drowning. وعلى الحامل, and the woman that's pregnant. والمرضع, and the one that's breastfeeding. إذا أفطرتا خوفا على الولد. If they broke their fast because they feared the well-being of their child. So as you can see, because there's a pattern here, if the fear is external to yourself, then fidya is needed. And that is a mud for the day along with making up the day, meaning making up that fast. Both things would be needed. However, if it's self, because you're traveling, because you're sick, because she's pregnant and she feels that her health is at jeopardy by fasting, right? Or she's breastfeeding and she feels that her health and well-being is in danger. No fidya is needed, just making the day up. He says, وَعَلَى مَنْ أَخَّرَ الْقَضَاءَ إِلَى رَمَضَانٍ آخَرَ بِغَيْرِ عُذْرٍ وَجَبَ مَعَ الْقَضَاءِ الْفِدْيَةِ. Now, if a person, and this is another person that also has to pay fidya, if a person missed days from a previous Ramadan until another Ramadan has entered, and they still have days from a previous Ramadan, well, every time a Ramadan enters and there's previous days, a fidya has to be given for the missed days. They still have to make up the days in fasting, but because another Ramadan has entered without fulfilling the previous Ramadan, then you'll have to give out per day a mud, one mud, putting both of your hands together and filling them up with a grain like rice. Tamam. وَمَنْ أَفْطَرَ بِغَيْرِ عُذْرٍ وَجَبَ عَلَيْهِ الْقَضَاءُ عَلَى الْفَوْرِ. And whoever broke their fast without a legitimate excuse, then there's a sense of urgency and immediacy when it comes to making up that day, because they didn't have an excuse to break that fast to begin with. And while this does not really pertain to most people, it's the next chapter and it's also equally important, so we'll read it over briefly. He says, فَصْلٌ فِي الْاعْتِكَافِ. An i'tikaf is staying within the masjid, on the masjid's property, for a duration. And the Prophet ﷺ used to do it in the last 10 days of Ramadan normally. People will do the full month, people will do the last 10 days. People do as much as they can. He says, وَشَرْطُ صِحَّةِ الْاعْتِكَافِ. In order for that i'tikaf to be sound and correct, what do you need? For the action itself, you'll need two things. He says, النِّيَّةُ, proper intention, وَاللُّبْثُ فِي الْمَسْجِدِ, staying at the masjid. Tamam. But what about with you? The things that must be present in order for your act to be considered valid. He says, Al-Islam, the person needs to be a Muslim. Al-Aqlu, sanity, the person needs to be sane, recognizing what's happening, what's going on. A woman would need to be what? Free from menses or postpartum bleeding. And the last one is At-Taharatu Anil Janabah. Be free from sexual impurity. You shouldn't even be in the masjid, really, if there's sexual impurity. And by this, alhamdulillah, we were able to break down these two chapters, fasting and i'tikaf, in a short and concise way, where you'll be able to listen to it quickly. We have the words on the screen, so that way you have your basic knowledge down for fasting, and you also have covered the chapter of fasting in the book that we are covering. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept your fasting, your prayer, and your dua. Allahumma ameen.